Peace be with you and welcome to Netroots Nation 2025 web series. I'm Reggie Hubbard, the host for today. I will be welcoming Mila and Sujata to the stage so they can talk to us a little bit more about engaging with local news outlets and how to influence media narratives. So Mila and Sujata, welcome. Sujata, show is yours.
Thank you so much, Reggie. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sujata Subramanian. I am here with my colleague Milo Vassallo. We are really excited to be presenting this virtual session at Netroots Nation to talk about something that impacts every single progressive issue we care about, the media. The session is called Engaging with Local News Outlets, How to Influence Media Narratives, and that title is intentional because whether you're working on climate, reproductive rights, voting rights, or economic justice, media narratives shape what people believe is possible, what they vote for, and what policies actually get implemented. Right now, most Americans are living in an information environment dominated by for-profit and corporate media. Their goal is engagement and ad revenue, not democracy, nor not truth, and definitely not elevating progressive values. So in this session, we'll talk about how you can engage with local outlets in a way that's strategic, effective, and builds long-term relationships. We'll share practical tips, examples, and tools you can use to influence the conversation, not just react to it. A little bit about us. We are the Media and Democracy Project. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit, all-volunteer grassroots organization formed in 2020. Our mission is simple but ambitious: to fight for a more informative and pro-democracy media that truly operates in the public interest. And when we say media, we don't just mean cable news. We're talking about the entire information ecosystem, what people see on TV, hear on the radio, read online, and share on social media. Right now, that ecosystem is dominated by corporate and right-wing media narratives that shape elections, shape policy, and shape what people think is even possible in this country. That's why our work focuses on three big areas: supporting local and nonprofit journalism, advancing media literacy and media criticism, and fighting for legislative and regulatory reforms to strengthen the media environment. The bottom line is we can't win on any issue if we lose the media battle. So let's take stock of the battlefield. Our democracy is being undermined by uninformed, misinformed, and disinformed voters and non-voters. This is not an accident. It's the result of decades of concentrated media power. Corporate media's job isn't to inform, it's to make money. Social media platforms don't prioritize truth, they prioritize engagement, which often means outrage and misinformation. And guess what? These platforms do not have democracy as their prime objective. So here's the reality. If we care about climate, about voting rights, about racial justice, media has to be our second issue right after our first. To paraphrase both former FCC Commissioner Nick Johnson and the great academic Bob McChesney, whatever your first issue of concern, media had better be your second, because without change in the media, progress in your primary area is far less likely. Here's a concrete example of how distorted media narratives shape reality. A September 2023 Ipsos poll showed that 60% of Republicans and 40% of Democrats believed unemployment was at a 50-year high. In reality, unemployment was a near historic low. Think about that. Majorities of voters from both parties went to the polls without a grasp of basic facts. That's not a failure of policy communication, that's a failure of our media system. And when people are voting based on misinformation, it affects everything downstream: elections, policies, and trust in government. But here's where we find hope. People still trust local journalism more than national news and far more than social media. Local reporters live in our communities. They care about real issues affecting real people around them. That makes them a critical entry point for shaping narratives. The problem is that local newsrooms are shrinking and stretched thin. They're looking for sources, stories, voices, and that's where you come in. When activists engage with local media, you help build a healthier information ecosystem. You can help them ensure accurate, values-driven content, and can counteract disinformation and bring context back into the public conversation. And you can help amplify the voices of those hardworking local journalists and contribute to keeping your local publications afloat. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Milo in just a second to go into more detail and some concrete ways in which you can start engaging with local media today. If you have any questions for us at any point, please drop them in the chat and we'll get to them during the session or follow up with you afterwards. And now over to Milo.
Well, Sujata, wonderful background, and always a pleasure to do these events with you on the Zoom. And thank you for those who are spending some time thinking about this issue of media and the role of media in informing our communities. As Sujata said, there are many reasons that Americans are underinformed, misinformed, and disinformed, but we've seen a particular opportunity that has twofold benefits, and that has to do with local news. One is, I'm sure most folks on spending time watching this understand that public media has been under assault. Local news is in the decline. The ad revenues that used to support local journalism have vanished with the advent of the internet and internet commerce. And that's true. There still are incredible local outlets that are still doing the job of informing their communities. And those local outlets, number one, need our support. Those of us who are thinking about democracy and progress in America, we want to support local news to inform our communities. But there's also an opportunity we've seen that local news outlets are able to be engaged with in a productive manner. And so that's what we're going to review some examples of. And as we think of some strategies with regards to engaging local news outlets, both to support them, but also as well as communicating what we see as necessary progress in America. So thinking of reaching out to news organizations is more than just a PR opportunity, but build some relationships. We're going to share some examples of what we've done and some in our communities have done. And we'd love for you to join us in building some accountability. The idea is a lot of news outlets are, overworked, underpaid, and taking shortcuts and aren't really sure how to frame progressive issues and frame issues for their audience. A classic example is repro rights, bodily autonomy versus pro-life. And so helping reach out to outlets, and we've found that the smaller outlets are much more easily accessible and more likely to respond to community engagement. And we'd like to build what we think needs to be built, and hopefully, you'll get our emails, and we'd love to hear from you. But we're in the process of building a community of accountability of progressive organizations, a coalition of sorts that can, when there are specific issues that need improved messaging and outreach, there is power and strength in numbers and diversity. So we'd love for you folks to reach out to us and be part of our coalition as we go forward, improving community engagement with media orgs, but also on the national level, especially around the issues that are pro-democracy and press freedom. And we'd also like to do some praise of journalists, and something we'll talk about shortly. So let's move to the next slide, please. So one thing that we'd like to start with is what really are the special, unique characteristics of local news outlets and journalists is they are more fact-based, more reality-based, and part of the information ecosystem. They're there on the front lines. They're seeing the factories close. They're seeing hospitals shut down. They're seeing, ICE and people disappeared on the streets. So local news outlets are actually forced to deal with the realities of policy. So we describe them as a little more fact-based, reality-based, and they really do more often than not have a real goal to inform. Journalists, though, in an important point, are definitely overworked and underpaid, have limited time. And something, if you haven't engaged with journalists, it's very satisfying. They appreciate the outreach. There's a gigantic right-wing ecosystem and trolls and people who just heckle journalists for reporting on reality. And so when they get responses from communities members who say, listen, I love the piece you wrote, thanks for writing, that actually is helpful to them and supportive as well. And something important to remember is you folks with different areas of expertise in your specific areas of interest are subject matter experts, and rarely are journalists subject matter experts. So thinking of yourself as someone who can inform and be a resource is a huge step to have for a journalist. And so there's a long game to consider in terms of doing some outreach to journalists, that you can offer yourself up as an issue expert, a subject matter expert, and they appreciate that. It saves them having to look someone up cold once they get to know you over time. And also something important to remember is journalists, by definition, good journalists aren't insulated. They do want engagement. They do want people to reach out to them. They do need to hear from people. So it's actually not that hard to find a local journalist outlet's email or their social media handles and engage with them, either most good outreach strategies, or maybe DMing them or emailing them. But by definition, they're a lot easier to reach, and especially at local outlets, than say someone who works at the New York Times or the Washington Post. And so there is a means of communication and accessibility that is often overlooked. Lots of media strategies have often been relegated to a social media or a PR campaign, and just hope that there'll be some traction, as opposed to building some relationships. And something as we like to say is that, just like democracy, all democracy is local, all media and news is really fundamentally local. And so finding an outlet, and we'll give you some tips on how to do that, and some of the journalists locally, is a real opportunity to build some relationships for the long term. Next slide, please. So in addition to being accountable allies, next slide, please. And so here are some of the considerations. So as we've thought about this for the last 5 years, engaged in this kind of work, whether it's direct outreach that I'll do directly to a journalist after reading something, both positive or negative, for some feedback. Thinking of what your strategies are may help kind of how you approach this subject matter. Are you looking for something relatively small, which is, trying to shift the narrative by altering language, abduct versus deport, pro-life versus bodily autonomy and repro rights? Is there a goal to improve the language that your community or a community is being exposed to by a journalist? Or is it something a bit larger, and this is the repro rights, pro-life, or healthcare? Impact framing is a little bit more complex. So that's unlikely something that the second one that you'll be able to do with just a simple one-off email. It's to be a resource and to provide sources and experts in the area, if not yourself. And then there's some interesting, this is another question that you can consider is your goal by doing outreach more of not just public relations, like cover our subject, but that is also a different question or a different goal than asking, are you trying to reframe something, either language or by coverage? You want more coverage. And one of the ways to do that is by offering yourself as a resource and taking national issues and making them local, and giving the local journalists an opportunity to have you as a resource, or your community or your organization as a resource. Covering less of a subject, there's stories that seem to consume a lot of media attention. Some of that's a complicated issue. Sometimes that's intentional, but certainly thinking that sometimes you may ask, why are you spending so much time covering this at the expense of issue X? And then there's something we engage in, and this is something we'd love to have relationships across the country and with civic orgs who aren't necessarily media based, is media criticism. There are standards of coverage that really whitewash really important issues. And so, for example, we can see it as, I think it is safe to say that most folks would say that what is happening in Israel, assault on the Palestinians in Gaza, would be described as a genocide, but very few newspapers are feeling comfortable using that language. And so there needs to be some coalitions formed that can, with large numbers, leverage their size and numbers to cajole and coax and explain to news organizations. So this isn't just criticism for criticism's sake, but to explain and provide resources. Because by and large, journalists are receptive when given courteous resources and criticism with explanations. Not just this piece sucks, why'd you write it, is really why did you frame it as this? Other people are framing it as that. What do you think about that? We'll talk more about that. And fixing factual errors, that's sometimes necessary, but these are the different ways of the goals of outreach you might consider. And I think it's worth going through these internally, and then starting, if you haven't thought of this as how do you build some muscles in engaging your local news outlets in some of these issues around coverage. Next slide, please. So there are multiple, the information ecosystems are complex and all very related. For the point of our talk today, we're going to focus specifically on online and print local news. There is certainly broadcast local TV, there is local radio. The strategies certainly could apply, but for now we'll focus on the print and online. And we also will share with you shortly, we have made a local journalism directory to help you find, if you haven't already, local news in your community. And if you're a national org, how to help your community members find local news orgs that are both credible, respectable, and worthy of both your subscription and attention, and also engaging as well. So we'll share with you that local journalism directory. It's on our website, mediademocracyproject.org. But that is a searchable directory, 50 states, to find local news outlets. We explain our criteria online of what is included, but just to kind of give you that it is a little bit more complicated in this information environment to find local news. Sometimes all is not what it seems. So for example, there are certainly good quality local outlets, owned and operated, have roots in the community, the editorial staff and leaders in the community. Does not have to be nonprofit, just as a side, certainly, and other aspects of American society that is often ideal to have a nonprofit motive. But it is worth noting that journalists and news outlets running for profit do not necessarily mean that that is a bad thing. It is America, and it is okay for a news organization to have to meet them and pay the bills and not depend on the nonprofit structure. But point being, local is paramount in terms of its efficacy in informing the community, and so those are individual outlets. There are local chains that may own a handful of outlets. Then there's some larger larger owners that are more national, and some of those do not have an informed public as their prime directive, and some of those you may have heard of. Alden Global Capital is one, and they own a lot of outlets. Now, it's, in my opinion, worth still subscribing, but recognizing that as you engage these outlets, you'll probably have a little bit more challenge to influence and engage and build relationships with some of the more hedge fund owners that have a very specific corporate structure and agenda, but not impossible. And then lastly, just to highlight for those unaware, there unfortunately now, this has been exacerbated with AI technologies, something called pink slime, which has been basically, it's a riff off, if people remember in the 80s, there were people ripping off the federal government serving America's school children a fake hamburger meat sludge that was dyed pink, that was served and sold to public schools as a substitute for hamburger meat. And that was pink slime is what that was called. So someone has named a news product that really isn't what it seems, that gives the appearance of local. It's poor quality news. They may actually be stealing people's content. But those are news outlets. I wouldn't even want to call them news outlets. Those are online sources that you'd really don't want to engage with and try and build relationships with. And good luck if you could, because they're often not even actually staffed by real humans. But want to put that on your radar screen as you start saying, does our org want to build some devoted resources to engaging local? Be aware of kind of the different ownership structures, and of course this outlier but very prolific. There's several thousand of these fake news websites that we'll refer to as pink slime. You know, they'll sound very real. It might be the Peoria Gazette Times. Not that that sounds very real, but they're made sound real and authentic and look and have, you know, Times font headline headers, but they may not actually be real. So we're going to give you a resource that you can certainly do your due diligence. By no means is our directory fully complete by any means. There are plenty of outstanding outlets that aren't in there, but we can say that the outlets in our directory are not pink slime, and so just keep that on your radar as well. In some cities, their local outlet happen to be large national chains, and that poses a bigger challenge in terms of trying to influence, but certainly worth doing, and certainly worth forming coalitions to form some power with numbers to make an effect change. And something else to consider, you may notice as we spend a lot of time in the space, a lot of local outlets syndicate a lot of content from national orgs. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, that the front pages of a lot of news orgs is actually really syndicated content from USA Today, New York Times, and others, even the Washington Post. As their staffs are so small, they're syndicating a lot of their content. But the remaining journalists are doing excellent work, and we'd suggest engaging with them. Next slide, please. So I think one of the things we think about is who are the points of contact? How can you form relationships with an ultimate goal of supporting both the news outlets, but also your cause? Is it journalists? Is it editors? Is it assignment editors, standard desk editors? Is it the PR of the news organization? And is it even the publisher, for example? And then also thinking, what is your time frame and your priority here? And so the journalists are the kind of the outward facing components of the news organization. They're the most accessible, the most eager to have polite diplomatic exchanges with their readers. So thinking of this as a good entry point into the concept of building some strategies of how do you build relationships with local outlets is thinking of engaging with journalists. As I said, their social media, their emails are very often available because they're often looking for tips or news sources and stories. So that would be an excellent place to start. But as we go up the proverbial food chain, it gets harder and harder to find who these people are. But a realistic goal, if you're a sizable civic org or a motivated civic org, is potentially influencing a standard desk editor. That standard desk editor is the person who decides, are they going to use certain language throughout the news source to reflect specific agendas. So for example, a bigger example on an international level is the Associated Press earlier this year. Their standards desk editor and the Associated Press itself, as you may recall, felt that with the Trump administration's changing of, or attempt to change the names of National Monument, Mount McKinley, to Mount McKinley, and then also changing an attempt to change the Gulf of Mexico's name. It was the standards desk at the Associated Press that said they can't make that change. There's a group of most senior editors in a news organization that make these determinations that ultimately have really profound impact. They're the unseen heroes, generally speaking, of well, not always heroes, often heroes, and that, at least in that case, in the Associated Press, of determining what are the standards in terms of framing and language that news orgs will use. Another example is, will they call a lie a lie? So those are the sorts of things that can be made at the standards desk. So, and these are public positions, and we don't, by no means do we ever, dox or be hypercritical. What we think of is you achieve more success with honey than with vinegar, and also think of this as a long-term strategy of engaging with your local news outlets. They're your members, you or your members are part of these communities, and this is a long-term relationship. So by all means, the goal is to build a strong working relationship of mutual respect and avoid sabotaging that relationship over a very specific issue, if at all possible. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? So first things, we feel very strongly that regardless of if you plan on developing some strategies to engage with local news outlets, everybody who is interested in democracy and progressive values knows we need, number one, a better informed America. And local news is the most trusted source of news still. Yes, people get information from social media and all other sources right now, and people have to pay for jump firewalls, have to pay to jump firewalls, but at the end of the day, local news is still trusted. These are people showing up at local events, still trying to cover City Hall, and people do have more faith in their local journalists and their local news outlets, than their national ones. So cultivate that relationship with intention. It's bi-directionally beneficial, mutually beneficial. You need those local papers to hold the line and continue to report reality, even not specifically of your civic cause of interest. We need people knowing what's happening with climate, what's happening with the economy, what's happening with abductions. Like those things need to be reported independently of specific social justice causes. So we think specifically that it is an action, and we ask everybody who comes to one of our media and democracy projects to subscribe to at least 1 or 2 local outlets, and if you can afford, chip in. A lot of local news outlets are actually free. It just takes the desire and the intention to subscribe. So subscribing and having your communities to subscribe. If you're a local civic org, have your community all subscribe. Make it a day of local journalism. Lift up, elevate the local journalists, and have your community subscribe. And that is the beginning, is forming that relationship. Acknowledge they're there. It's not just about, issuing press releases and posting stuff on socials. It's about also supporting their work, which is to, promote a free press and a free press and supportive democracy. So number 1, subscribe, plant the seeds of this type of work and subscribe to your local outlets. Ask your community members to subscribe and share the good work that they do. A lot of folks are in the habit of taking a piece they read at a large national outlet and sending that around. Local journalists, you can do the same thing with local outlets. So share the good work and highlight and praise the good work when there are some local outlets, and build those positive relationships. Also, as I said, specifically, there's ways to engage them. If you're having events and functions, don't just consider it a press release and send them a press release, but literally invite them to one of the working meetings or one of the projects. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the pro-democracy protests, and as opposed to just announcing it on socials that there's going to be another No Kings protest, invite the journalists to come join and to the sign making event or kind of the post-game huddle after one of your monthly sessions. So, and specifically inviting them to engage with your work. And so one of the things that we also will talk about are other strategies besides this, but this is kind of foundational, is actually find their local outlets, subscribe to them, support them, and advise your communities that there still is local news. It's not just all what's in the stream and online. Next slide, please. So if this positive outreach, and we'll talk about some of the other strategies, but number 1 is engaging the journalists directly. There's also the opportunity to write letters to the editor. I think we'll talk about that in a second, but it's important to know that this isn't just a fantasy on my part and our part, that this is that you just say nice things about local journalists and they're going to come cover your cause and get to know you and assume you're a resource. There will be plenty of times that there is either seems to fall on deaf ears, or the coverage is really contrary to what your stated goals are. And then it's appropriate to take it up a notch and approach this slightly differently, which is engage in media criticism. And media criticism isn't just some heady, reserved for people who went to journalism school or former editors. It is an opportunity for everyone, and that can be correcting headlines and using social media. So for example, a classic one is to kind of highlight what's wrong with a piece. Maybe its headline is the most obvious. Correct it and put that on socials, and potentially even tagging the journalist or the outlet. That obviously is heading more towards burning bridges than building relationships. But if you do reach that point, this is kind of advanced local journalism media engagement recommendation, but actually engaging in public corrections, and also engage publicly, not necessarily respond. I've been unfortunately blocked by multiple national journalists as I've asked very innocent questions publicly. But I think, unfortunately, publicly, people do understandably have a thin skin at times, especially in this environment that's very difficult for journalists. But being diplomatic about it certainly is appropriate. So think about publicly engaging in media criticism. If an outlet continues to not report the story in a way that you think is accurate, it is going publicly, but being very clear, respectful about the differences, why that headline masks that what is happening is in why that normalizes something that's counter to your cause. And if you haven't, we've listed a bunch of experts. If you'd like to build some muscles and read what media criticism folks do, it's very accessible and it's somewhat invigorating to see how other people are processing how this is, especially at the national level, news orgs are not meeting the moment of a constitutional crisis and an assault on our democracy and society across the board. These folks, Dan Frumkin, Parker Malloy, Margaret Sullivan, Mark Jacob, Fairness and Accuracy Reporting, and ourselves, several times a month are putting out examples of what's not being done at the national level. This also trickles down, of course, to the local level, but you can learn from these folks how they think about what media coverage should look like. And also by criticizing it, you learn and see kind of how things should be better and advocate for better. So thinking of engaging in some local criticism publicly is another way to hopefully influence, or at least influence, community members, how they see what is being produced locally. The next slide, please. So here are some examples. So that's something that one can do individually. I know that I personally and multiple members of our community individually will send off emails to a journalist and say, that was a great piece, a questionable piece. I'll show you examples in a second, or in a few minutes. So the ways that this can be done is individuals can engage journalists in a one-on-one. I find that actually is the most satisfying, because I'd say about 10% of the time engaging a journalist, that they actually do respond. So it doesn't have, it's a lot higher than you'd expect, but it's not that high. So don't be surprised. Maybe you'll have better luck, but I certainly recommend in doing that. So potentially giving a journalist an opportunity to see your point of view, giving resources, etc. But here's another level of that, which is these are two groups that we've come across and helped support in one way or another in the last few years. This is an example of a community that has formed a media watchdog group. This is in a large city. And what that church does is, this is a faith-based community, and they've created a coalition of churches and carceral reform members, people interested in carceral reform. And what they do is they record evening local news. I know I said we're talking papers, but I'm just giving an example of this is a paradigm of communities forming media watchdog and accountability groups, and they record the local evening newscast to monitor for racist coverage, for stereotypes, for fear-mongering, and the leadership, because this is a larger group. This isn't just a one-off, one person criticizing that, why are they always the first story of the evening news, local news is crime, and why are they showing these, why is it always people of color, which is disproportionately inaccurate in terms of the reality of what's happening in that community. That's typical stuff you think of a Fox News does at the national level. Sometimes local news folks do that. What this organization did is they formed a coalition to create some power, because it is multiple organizations and faith-based institutions that actually would meet with the program directors of the local news outlets periodically, not just to criticize them, but to support them. But they would from time to time say, this, the tenor of the evening news is leaning too hard and the stereotypes are unacceptable. And they actually were able to impact the coverage of some of these local news stations, would respond to that sort of feedback from the community. Next, one of our members has gone to her circle of progressive orgs, and they built specifically a media accountability group, and this was across repro rights, this was racial justice, this was faith-based folks. They periodically, once a month, put together a coalition that would discuss media issues related to progressive values. And because it is so many institutions, civic orgs, they were able to form peer engagement with some of the large statewide papers and have examples of influencing the coverage there. So showing where this can go is starting small, thinking purely at local, but it actually can be built up over time to actually impact even statewide coverage. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? Let's go back to some of the basics of this, the tactics or strategies is, so specifically direct emailing. I don't know if this was a traditional Zoom, I'd ask folks how many people have reached out and tried to engage with a journalist and hear people's experience, but by and large, done respectfully from a position of respect, journalists do respond to engagement that is constructive. I think it's also satisfying as you consider yourself a consumer. And so thinking of it as you're just an educated consumer engaging the source of the product that you're consuming. So don't be shy. It is totally appropriate when done, respectfully. Another next level way to influence coverage, this people know, but I think it's helpful to think about. First order is reach out directly with journalists, build some engagement, find the beat reporter who's covering issues that touch on what your areas of interest are. The second level, which is somewhat higher and can reach a few more people, is letters to the editor about your issue. That local outlets are very happy to have letters to the editor. It's very hard to get your letters to the editor published in a national outlet, but getting published in a local paper certainly has a better opportunity of getting published there. And then the next level of terms of letters to the editor is not just about your subject of interest, but a letter to the editor specifically talking about coverage of your area of interest is something else. Specifically commenting on, you could do a little mini project. Why have of the last 30 days in our local paper, despite all the storms and what's happened in Texas and the, changes to the climate crisis, why have there been no stories on the front page of our local paper that involved climate? ? And see how that goes. And then in terms of, I just noticed in the chat a very good point, another letter to the editor specifically addressed to electeds, an opportunity. And once again, the advantage is in local papers, you're more likely to have your letters to the editor published. So if you're looking for resources of where to publish letters to the editor, we'll share with you our local journalism directory. It has 2,000 plus outlets for your communities. If you're national org or if you're local in a state, we've got some outlets that your members may have not known about, yet, and can consider those as opportunities both to improve coverage and build relationships, support those outlets, and an opportunity for letters to the editor of these three types. And there certainly is some strength in numbers. How do we influence media coverage? So we talked about individuals, whether it's direct outreach and beginning to build some relationships. It's sending letters to the editor as an individual, but then community members. So for example, we'll get to that in a moment. We've formed some guidelines and we asked people to sign on to our letter, and then we shared that letter with news orgs. So thinking of forming coalitions, and that's why we'd like folks here. We'd love to have other org leaders reach out to us as we build a coalition of both accountability, specifically around media issues and progressive values. Next, a coalition, modeling off that situation I explained where 20 different civic orgs in one state got together and meet periodically and form their own local accountability committee. That is something that everyone could initiate here. And that is something else to consider, is forming your own local coalition. And then national coalitions is really the goal, and why we'd love for folks to reach out to us via email and as we start putting together or build on what we have in terms of a coalition that can help influence media coverage. Next slide, please. So this is a personal example back from 2021. A local journalist that I've been following their work was writing for months about the insurrection and the coup attempt in 2021. And I was uniformly respectful in all my outreach, critical. And here's just an example, a screenshot of one of our email exchanges. Hoping you're well. In your piece, you chose to use the word uprising. There is no doubt it was an attempt to overthrow American democracy on multiple levels. Why use the euphemism the insurrection? It was an attack on American democracy and should never be minimized. I mean, that's not offensive. That's just reaching out, and it's, normal salutation, because once again, I consider local journalists accountable allies. They're not the opposition. So I struck up a relationship over a year or so with this journalist, and a couple times a year would reach out. But this was one that was just a bridge too far, referring to, this is now on September 21st, 8 months after the insurrection, to call it an uprising struck me a little bit wrong. So I sent off this email, and next slide, please. He responded, "Hi, Milo, long time no see. I hope you're well too. I've referred to Jan 6th in several ways over the last 8 months, and quote, peaceful demonstration hasn't been one of them. It was an uprising. It was also an insurrection, maybe a riot too. I'm not allowed to publish shit show." So I just use this as a light example of the kind of strategies that we think are helpful and would and hope to inspire folks to do, is to build some of these relationships with people who cover issues that are important to you. So they are, once again, in need and in hunger of respectful engagement. It has never been harder to be a journalist right now, whether it's financial or emotional. They literally, we're on a coalition of that supports journalists in regards to press freedom, but they're support groups now for journalists no longer that have just been in war zones, but for journalists who are like practicing journalism in America in 2025. So think of this engagement not being limited just to, this is, I would say, somewhat gentle criticism of changing language and framing, of course, but also an opportunity to engage these amazing people who have a really challenging job right now, and supporting them in what they do. New paragraph, or sorry, next slide. So this was and something else. I think on that note, one of the things that I really enjoy doing, and we in our community have done regularly, is we have something called Heroes and Zeros, where we praise the people doing great work and share their work and highlight them and even make little certificates and send them. We have monthly heroes, for example, but they're even smaller heroes that we love to just say thank you to. And so besides thinking of this as an opportunity to build a relationship and that you can cajole people to see and explain to them how to cover your issue of concern better, think of it as an opportunity to also praise the ones who are really doing good work. So we have the Thank a Journalist projects where we really just remind folks to thank a journalist. So I like to go for a 1-to-1 ratio personally, that if I'm going to reach out to some journalists with what I think is an overall critical feedback, I got to find at least one journalist that I can actually send something nice to, because I assure you their inbox is just filled with shit and negative criticism, because that's unfortunately the life of a journalist these days. This was something we did which was very exciting, is we got together as the Media Democracy Project and made what we thought, after years of thinking about national but also local coverage of elections, what would pro-democracy election coverage look like? And so these were 3 different categories: cover elections like they matter more than sports scores, make threats to democracy clear, and protect Americans from disinformation, with 18 small specific explanations like don't use stenography. Some basic stuff culled from a lot of the media experts that we admire, but we tried to create a guideline for people to follow. And we sent this to the leading 12 newsrooms across the country. We didn't specifically have the bandwidth or the size yet to do this a lot with local outlets, but this would certainly translate as something, as an opportunity. It's an example of what are best practices in our perspective and sharing them respectfully with newsrooms hoping to improve coverage. Next slide. This got some juice. This was something that we got 5,000 people to sign on to. We got positive feedback from multiple people, journalists, editors, including the much esteemed Margaret Sullivan, who described this as our urgently needed pre-election reform plan. You get a chance when you see these slides to learn more. You can go to the website and see our pro-democracy election coverage guidelines. That really is an example of creating an opportunity for a community to mobilize and lend their support. But it wasn't just like a petition. We sent that to newsrooms. These were national newsrooms, so to not much surprise, we didn't get direct feedback from the publisher of the Washington Post and the New York Times, did not respond directly. But this is something that we use just as an example of is creating a guidelines and sharing those with newsrooms. And we would like, as with time, to build up the capacity to really follow this up with further projects like this. Next slide. So events is a definitely big opportunity. I'm sure there are many people in comms who know this better than I do and better than we do. But we like to think of this as a little more sticky than just the typical comms, is we want to form relationships with these people. And so besides the press release, which is somewhat ethereal, but potentially even tagging tips at a news org or PR, and tagging on socials, tagging journalists who cover the relevant beat if you can't find their direct email or they're not responsive. I think one of the more obvious examples of media coverage of late, and we're going to have some slides about this, is coverage of the pro-democracy movement protests and demonstrations, No Kings, etc. National news orgs have kind of covered it, but local news orgs have really been covering it. John Lewis event days were covered in many local outlets, did not cover the New York Times, Washington Post, or Wall Street Journal, did not get front page coverage, and minimal coverage, if any, elsewhere. So, and then basically force them to see that you guys are doing work, invite them to the sessions, or, tag the journalists with your, post-event summaries or your post-protest huddle. But thinking of specifically other ways to just engage them in the work that you're actively doing, because right now it seems across the board very little coverage taking place of the pro-democracy and progressive movement. A lot of that is by nature the corporate influence of media, but that is most powerful at the national levels. Local outlets are always looking for stories and following folks in the community. So don't be discouraged that national outlets don't follow things like the indivisible movement in your neck of the woods, or your repro rights group specifically, or your racial justice movement, but actually local outlets are more likely to engage with those. So do give them an opportunity to see what's happening in their community. Next slide, please. This is a pretty neat, more recent, but tragic because of the context, but a group recognized that as the Trump administration destroys our public health system, our research system, amongst other destructions of our society. This is a group of scientists recognized that they had an opportunity to impact their communities of the significance of what was happening at the federal level with the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, as they had a campaign where these journalists wrote letters in their local papers. I use this to highlight that this is an opportunity that we're talking of subject matter today, this concept of engaging and thinking of local news as an opportunity to get your message out as part of those communities. This is a great example of scientists using their local papers as an opportunity to explain why what's happening in DC is going to be so bad, not just for the scientists themselves, but for American society and, frankly, world health and science. Next slide. So these are specifically examples of, next slide. I just want to go through it. Whoop, next slide. I think somehow we skipped. So a slide vanished, I think. Well, oh, I know what it is. Go back. Nope. All right. My apologies. A slide disappeared. Next slide, please. So what we've done is we've made what we call rubrics. A rubric is an opportunity for you as a leader in your community, in your civic org, of what you think best media practices is or are around your subject matter. This is basically the text box that actually accompanied a rubric of about 6 points, very brief sentences of how we as a community feel repro rights need to be covered. Because we want people to feel empowered that when they read that article, they know what to do if they have a disagreement, or how they can frame a response, not just be like, that article wasn't right, I don't think they did a good job, but specifically give them guidance of about 5 or 6 bullet points in this context of a rubric that then your community can be and have ready to go. So when they read a story, did it frame it with X, Y, and Z? Was the language proper? If it wasn't, why should it be? And what was and what was included that shouldn't have been there, what wasn't included that should have been in there. And thinking of creating rubrics around your areas of interest is another way, not just to empower individuals to better understand and be advocates for your cause, but also to literally engage with media. So we made these rubrics to guide our community, giving them guidance of how to respond to articles that do not adequately cover repro rights and the assault on women's bodily freedom. We did one on repro rights, and we've done another one on the climate crisis. So you can go to our website, mediademocracyproject.org, and under things we do, and there's 2 little rubrics. But this is something every civic org could do and empower their members, have a day of action specifically geared towards press, especially local outlets, where your community is now empowered with those talking points, specifically, though, not just talking points about your issue, but on the coverage of your issue. And that can be done at the leadership level and crowdsourced by your community and your civic orgs. But those rubrics we found are very popular. As we scale up, we'd like to make more of those. But we have one for repro rights, check it out, and also one on climate. Next slide, please. And something else we've done is we have, in the Media Democracy Project, built out a space for our members, not just to it's great that communities are beginning to make space for members to write letters to the editor, but we also want people to submit comments specifically, regulatory comments about media issues, comment sections. But the big one that I think is wonderful is to give people the confidence to engage and connect with journalists and editors. So a little workshop to give best practices by some of our most experienced media outreach folks is what are best practices and how you engage journalists, you thank a journalist and that sort of business, but dedicating some space, not just to letters to the editor specifically in support or about your cause, but also giving people some of the fundamentals of how do you address the people who are writing those stories. Next slide, please. So we have a Mad Media Writers Workshop. So I mentioned this in passing, we really go out of our way to thank a journalist. And so maybe thinking of who are the journalists that are covering your issue, either nationally or locally in ways that you think are appropriate, elevate them, have little awards for them, share that work, empower your community to take the work of that journalist. Maybe it's a journalist in another city who's doing excellent work covering your cause, and empower your community to say, share this, and also to share with journalists who aren't replicating or writing similar work and explaining respectfully why that is a good example of what should be coming and should be done with media coverage. And also think in terms of, I mentioned this again, think long-term. These are relationships that you really hope you can build and for the long term. So don't come in hot. Why aren't you covering our story? Or why do you always XXX? Think of this as help them see your position and gradually maybe you can convince them of seeing your point over time. It may take months, years even. I use that example of that simple engagement regarding insurrection versus uprising. That's a personal pet peeve, more than a pet peeve. I personally take that as an affront. So that always gets me to fire off some type of exchange, but I try not to come in hot. But keep it simple, keep it short. Remember, journalists are overworked and overstressed. I will share that I often write too much in some of these engagements. Keeping it short and sweet is definitely better and always respectful. And we have a list of our heroes, just to give you a heads up of who we've highlighted in the last few months. Antelnes, whose cartoon was spiked by Jeff Bezos' Washington Post. The Associated Press, specifically for their standards desk, refusing to change the Gulf of Mexico while explaining the rationale and going forward and moving ahead and changing it to Mount McKinley based on the international explanations of the propriety of doing so. Ruth Marcus leaving the Washington Post. Bob McChesney, our hero, who's really set the stage for what is public media and set a goal for us to aspire to. ProPublica, 404 Media, Wired, Tech Dirt are four outlets doing a great job. And also Scott Pelley, and most recently a political cartoonist, Adam Zieglitz at the Buffalo News. These are our heroes. So find those heroes who are writing about your issue. Hopefully they're there. Support the ones that do and elevate their work and empower your community to share their work, especially giving it to some local outlets to see what best practices of coverage might be. Next slide. Here it is. Here's the rubric, just so you get a sense. This is so. What if you're angry about how the media covers abortion? Here's five bullet points that should be included in helping people send off respectful emails to either the news outlet, the journalist who didn't follow these guidelines. Next slide. And those are concise and empowering. And No Kings coverage. So just as an example, something we follow at the national level, but also at the local level. Next slide. Is local outlets are doing a much better job. I mean, if anybody in this community has been going to some of the pro-democracy demonstrations, you've probably not seen much in the national news about it, but local outlets really are following the story. These are real people in real communities that are going to the streets and making a ruckus and getting into good trouble. And local outlets will report that from Florida to Alaska. This is what democracy looks like. I never dreamed I'd see that as a headline in a newspaper. Unfortunately, the times are now, but this is power to the South Florida Sun Sentinel to recognize that that's in a pretty amazing front page. So similarly, these news orgs are open and ripe for engagement with their communities. And here's the El Diario with the, Immigrants Make America Great sign. I mean, this is, we dream for a day when national outlets will feel confident to do something like that. Next slide, please. So once again, we think thinking about media diets is something we really think about a lot and inspire our communities to engage in. Be mindful of what people are consuming, what your community is consuming. Limiting social media, cable news is junk food, but pollinate good information and good sources, and a lot of those are local. So demand and help and advocate for news orgs that make reality and democracy a priority. And local outlets do a much better job, generally speaking, especially the ones we've done our best to identify for folks, at reinforcing reality. So though local outlets aren't specifically partisan, they are a line of defense for reality against disinformation and misinformation, because that flood came through and did that to the town. That factory closed and people lost their jobs. There's no sugarcoating any of that. And local outlets report that in ways that national outlets are not necessarily doing. Next slide. And this is specifically something we'd like to share with you. If you haven't, this is our gift to you and everyone. It is a 50-state searchable local journalism directory. Please use it, put it to work, have an event around it, find your local outlets. If you have local outlets that are not included, we'd love to hear from you. We're always adding outlets, so please, it is by no means complete, but this is to provide you with a resource that you can find outlets in your state and community. And I think that's our last slide. So we've covered a lot. By no means are we subject matter experts on this area, but we are sharing with you how we approach the importance of local journalism, both for democracy, as defenders of reality for their communities, but also as an opportunity for us to engage and support for them, and how they can actually help us communicate our messages and our priorities. Sujata, I don't know if you've got any parting words, but I think with that, I'll say thank you for your attention. Thank you for your cause. Any attendee at Netroots is certainly someone that we'd be very interested in engaging and hearing from. So please, we'll drop our emails in the chat, and we'd love for you to reach out to us, attend our events. Something we didn't emphasize, we're virtual. We meet virtually via Zoom, so you're welcome to join the Media and Democracy Project, and we look forward to hearing from anyone. So thank you for your attention, and continue to fight for a better, informed, and progressive America. Thank you.
Thanks, Milo. And just, we can't drop our emails in the chat. It doesn't work that way, but I just want to encourage everybody to check out our local journalism directory. It is a really great resource to find your local outlets and start supporting them. It's a great place to start. So, and thank you all so much.
And somebody's put in the chat, yes, you will happily share these slides with you. Definitely. The only cost is you have to reach out to us. We'd love to hear how you put them to use.
Yes, and I to the session once it's up online. So
yeah, and we'd love suggestions as well, and hear people's success stories. This is a relatively, I think relatively novel strategy, and so we'd love to hear what other folks are doing. Thank you all.
Thank you.